Every artist eventually has to deal with that dreaded 9-letter word: marketing. Art can be made solely for private admiration, though it's probably fair to say that many, if not most artists, want their work to be enjoyed, analyzed, or at the very least, perceived by an audience. Somewhat paradoxically, it's easy to feel like you're selling out, like you're diminishing the worth of your work as well as your credibility as an artist by asking for the attention that you actually want your work to receive. Besides, time spent on creating marketing assets could be better spent on creating the art itself. What is perhaps the worst part of marketing, even if you're an honest independent artist with no intention of misleading anyone for money, is that audiences will sometimes mislead themselves by falling victim to their own expectations. When that happens, the art might be unfairly critiqued based on what the audience thought it would be, rather than what it is. One such case is the 2022 game Scorn. First shown in 2014, Scorn depicted a dark, post-apocalyptic world heavily inspired by the works of artists H.R. Giger and Zdzisław Beksiński. In the original Kickstarter campaign, developers Ebb Software wrote about being inspired by the open-ended and interconnected level design of games like Dark Souls and Metroid Prime, about how the player would need to gradually adapt to this world, to consider how it and its inhabitants are affected by the player's actions. There were going to be elements of inventory management, combat, and puzzles, where the player character would tangibly interact with the objects and machinery around them. While the first Kickstarter campaign failed to reach its €200,000 goal, and some of Ebb Software's grander ambitions didn't turn out quite the way they originally planned, it's hard to say that they didn't mostly stick to their overall vision all the way to the game's release 8 years later. But as the game kept being delayed, and the developers focused more on development than providing frequent updates for the backers of their second Kickstarter campaign, some remained unsure of what kind of game Scorn would ultimately end up being. Was it mainly going to be a puzzle game, a first-person shooter, or even one of those walking simulators that people keep getting mad about? Sure enough, when the game finally did release, the reception was, according to the review aggregation site Metacritic, mixed or average. Because when people got the game in their hands, they judged it by which one of those genres or subgenres they believed it belonged to. In some cases, they saw the game's way of conveying story through quiet exploration rather than verbal exposition to be an oversight, and trashed the game without even trying to engage with the text whatsoever.
Is there a story to it? Like,
there's no story. There's like negative story. This game is an anti-video game, I swear to God.
This is something that started as a Kickstarter project, and now it transformed into this over-glorified little artsy-fartsy fuck-all hell portal to nothing!
Yeah, I still would have preferred if they, had a story that wasn't just guessing.
And as for context, I'd welcome some. Scorn is what happens when the design document for your game is just a picture of H.R. Giger and then a lot of arrows pointing at it.
A lot of people are saying, oh, you just don't understand Scorn. This guy, I bet you play Call of Duty. There's a really smug attitude around this game of you don't understand. Scorn is an experience. It's an artistic journey through a dying world. There's a lot of I smell my own fucking fart energy around this game.
It's fucking trash, guys. Gameplay wise, you play, I don't know what the fuck, but whatever you play, can't jump, has no fucking knees.
Okay, hold on. Can we take a moment to discuss just how Super Mario brained this statement is? I'm not blaming this guy specifically. I want to call out how we have all been conditioned to believe that a jump button is such an essential part of a video game that it's required even when it serves no purpose. There's no platforming in Scorn. There is no climbing, and there's certainly no necessity for bunny hopping. So to criticize the game for not having something that it so obviously doesn't need, well, that is the quintessential example of falling victim to your own expectations, isn't it? And I would be lying if I said I didn't fall victim to my own. Once I learned that Scorn might contain more puzzles than combat, I started imagining a game in the vein of Myst or The Witness. A game I would have neither the skill nor the patience to get through without resorting to a guide every few minutes. I'm no stranger to using guides. I'm not ashamed of it either. But the game I imagined started to feel less and less worth the effort to play through. Since I was also not sure that my aging PC would be able to even boot up the game, I ended up ignoring Scorn on release. The only thing I picked up on was the mixed reception. So now, 2 years later, I will do what I should have done in the first place. I will critique Scorn on its own terms, try to make sense of its allegedly non-existent story, and determine the validity of the more negative comments it received at launch. What no doubt initiated the hype around Scorn was its Giger and Beksiński-esque visuals. There had been games that borrowed from these artists before. The 1992 point-and-click horror adventure Darkseed contained officially licensed artwork provided by Giger, and just 1 year before Scorn, Bloober Team's The Medium proudly declared Beksiński's body of work as its main visual inspiration. Scorn, by comparison, feels like the definitive video game adaptation of both of these artists' portfolios, because the influences aren't just for show. They inform how the world of the game functions, or functioned, mechanically and culturally. Giger's work, focusing on biomechanical metamorphosis, sexual desire, and bodily objectification, is used to explain the internal workings of this world, its societal values, as well as its skeleton-like architecture. Beksiński's work, being more about once great civilizations in decay, strange and impressive structures found in barren deserts, and the abstraction, corruption, and death of the human form, is used to depict the external aspects of the world. Not just the literal outdoors, but the external threats that are partially to blame for the world's current dying state. It feels especially validating that I wrote this part before I got my hands on the official art book of the game, where concept artist Filip Akovic confirms,
Giger's work was never chosen as an inspiration because it looked interesting or featured cool-looking imagery. We wanted to explore similar themes and it was just logical to go there. Giger's pretty much it if you want to explore the fusion of mankind and technology or sexuality and technology. The key visual representation of decay is informed by Beksiński. The way he depicted his worlds was never meant to be realistic, but it conveys decay really well, and it's extremely expressive. Everything merges together, forms become indistinguishable, cracked, hollow, and slowly rotting away in an almost spiderweb-like pattern.
The internal and external parts of Scorn's environments are also conveniently color-coded based on their respective aesthetics. Giger provides cold, metallic grays to the buildings and machinery, whereas Beksiński provides the colors of the alien atmosphere, and most importantly the fleshy reds of the hostile organic growths enveloping the mostly abandoned structures. There are designs that could be attributed to either Giger or Beksiński, an ambiguity that proves both how compatible these styles really are, along with Ebb Software's ability to create something unique by merging the styles. It's not entirely Giger's or Beksiński's world. It's Scorn. It's a rather empty place, though not without traces of things that once transpired. Humanoid corpses littering the dunes, old mechanisms locked into place by the aforementioned organic growths, murals depicting the scientific ambitions of a people who were ultimately destroyed by them. If it's not ancient history, at least it all went down while you were not around. Or you simply forgot about it for whatever reason. Maybe you just got here. Maybe you have always been here. Either way, it's a place so alien to you, the player, that it might as well be LV-426 from the film Alien. However, whether it's a distant planet, our own planet in the far future, or something else entirely, doesn't matter as much as what this place has to show you. The opening cutscene reveals a tower, one that the unnamed player character is determined to reach. That's as close to a direct instruction you will get. There's a tower. You must go to it. What's there? Who knows? Why do you need to go there? Fuck around and find out! There are answers, several of which are provided in the game's official art book, and there is in fact a story. But once the game starts proper, it's not the story that will drive you forward, but your curiosity, your hunger to explore, to take in the sights and learn about every little intricacy of this world. During my first session with Scorn, I got stuck very early on, because I couldn't tell if I had successfully cleared the first major puzzle, if there was still something left to do, or if I had completely broken something and soft-locked myself from making progress. Normally, this is the kind of uncertainty that would turn me off from playing a puzzle-focused game, even when the puzzle is something as simple as this sliding block type thing. But this time, that uncertainty grew into a feeling of immersion. There was a kind of ludo-narrative harmony in playing as a character who had just woken up in this world, and having that be reflected in my own infant-level understanding of how it operates. I worried that this immersion was gonna have to break eventually, once I faced a puzzle that was just too difficult or obtuse, finally forcing me to exit the game and pull up a walkthrough. To my surprise, that barely ever happened. I was so captivated by the rest of the experience that, once I hit a roadblock, my stubbornness got me through the majority of the puzzles on my own. They're not the most difficult anyway. There are a bunch of puzzles that can be brute forced by simply twisting and turning the mechanisms until they fit into place. Even so, Scorn managed to do something for me that very few horror games ever have. It turned my frustrations about puzzles into satisfaction. The game made me care about solving its puzzles because while they are arbitrary, they feel like a natural part of the setting. I mean, who am I to argue what does and doesn't make sense in a world that, at least in some aspects, works on completely different rules than our own? Now, some would argue that one of the problems with Scorn is the complete opposite, that the puzzles feel far too familiar against the otherwise alien backdrop. And sure, I did just compare one of them to a basic as hell block sliding puzzle. But since Scorn isn't solely a puzzle game, I believe Ebb Software struck a necessary middle ground. The puzzles are easy enough that a jackass like myself can solve them, and players who wished for more of a challenge will still get to enjoy the tension of what could potentially happen to the environment, to themselves, or someone else, once a puzzle is solved. The developers made it clear in their first Kickstarter campaign that they wanted the player character and their actions to feel physically connected to the environment. That ambition was certainly fulfilled with the final product. Aside from the heads-up display that fades into view whenever you aim a weapon or take damage, every element of the game is diegetic. Your inventory consists of pieces that are physically stuck to you, and every door, lock, lever, and switch requires the player character to reach out their arms and hands to visibly interact with them one way or another. Similarly to Outlast or Resident Evil Village, these hands aren't just the instruments of your progress, they gradually become a reflection of your progress, as well as your bodily degradation. In a world that frequently melds humanity with machinery, it's only natural that you would have to submit your own flesh in order to participate in it. You will quickly learn what these augmentations and tools do, but you won't have any idea how they work, how they were created, or what they could potentially do to you in the long term. And yet, if reaching that next area means putting your arm inside a device that painfully staples a Cronenbergian key to it, well, that's certainly what you will do now, isn't it? Fortunately, our world has no iPhone that will permanently attach itself to your palm. Not yet. But we do have a similar relationship with technology in our present day. No, I'm not gonna go on an out-of-touch rant about how kids are watching too much Skibbity Toilet on their tablets, but I will say that Giger foresaw just how dependent on technology we would eventually become, how eagerly we would submit ourselves to it. And it's never for free. There is the monetary aspect, of course, though more importantly, we often have to pay with our very being, our privacy. Scrolling through the terms of service and accepting it all without having read a single paragraph obviously doesn't affect us the same way sticking alien machinery to our bodies would. But in both scenarios, we are giving away a part of ourselves, or allowing something to intrude on our lives, for the sake of people and systems who will use our compliance for their own ends. This is where the story of Scorn comes in. Contrary to the game's lore, the story is actually quite simple, which makes me doubt that those who complain about there not being a story actually finished it.
May Scorn forever be in the pit of my non-played library.
Guys, honestly, I'll stop playing it, alright? Sue me, I haven't finished the game.
No shit. First, we need to establish that there are not one, but two playable characters. The first one, who I will refer to as the Parasite, for reasons that will soon be explained, drowns in a pool of literal magic cum by the end of the first act. And I'm not here to kink shame. The second character, who I will refer to as the protagonist, is introduced in the beginning of Act 2, just as they are being born. Although, like in the 1999 film The Matrix, people in this world are technically not born, but grown. Full grown even, through the process of eugenics. Deliberate or not, I'd almost go so far as to say that Scorn is partially a critique of the pro-life ethos. Even here, at the end of the world, new life is being created. It's been systemized, with a whole wall of organic pods that spit out any newborns into the depths below, with nothing but their umbilical cords to hang on to. Many of these newborns have and will inevitably die from the fall. Some have the privilege of being born closer to the ground, basically ensuring their short-term survival. But the system doesn't care about their odds or really anything that follows their birth. They simply must be born, for the sake of it. Once the protagonist is down on the ground, there's nothing to greet them but a vast desert of sand and corpses. From this point on, the protagonist is left to their own devices, with the only certainty being the inevitability of their own demise. This is the future Republicans want. The protagonist manages to traverse the desert and arrives at the tower, which compelled them just as much as it did the parasite. Specifically, they arrive in the same room where the parasite, and I have to reiterate this, drowned in literal magic cum, which transformed them into its namesake. It ambushes and attaches itself to the protagonist's body. And going forward, as the protagonist is forced to carry it around on their back, the parasite makes repeated attempts to rip and tear into the protagonist, eating away at their health bar in the process. This is what I mean when I say that the story of Scorn is simple. Because when you break it down, it's really just the old fable of the scorpion and the frog, but with more flesh and seminal fluids. For those unfamiliar, the story is about a scorpion who tries to convince a frog to carry it across a river. The frog is rightfully worried that the scorpion will sting it, but the scorpion points out how lousy that plan would be, given that it would cause both of them to drown. Convinced by the argument, the frog agrees. Though halfway across the river, the scorpion stings the frog anyway. In its dying moments, the frog asks why, and the scorpion regrettably replies that it's just in the scorpion's nature to sting. Despite resulting in its own death, the scorpion could not fight the urge to kill. There are multiple ways of reading this story, but considering the context of Scorn, I believe French sociologist Jean-Claude Passeron brings up an interpretation which makes the scorpion and the frog a very poignant comparison.
The suicidal scorpion is the prototype of the deceptive politician who is deceived by his own ability to improvise a pleading that is both logical and effective. He succeeded in persuading the frog and fooling it, but he did not have a deliberate strategy of lying, since the lie was fatal to him. In history, he appears as a virtuoso of utilitarian calculation, cheated by his own reasoning, and he is just as much the scorpion of this logical farce as the frog, the victim of his own naive belief in a deceptive rationality.
It's easy to spot the similarities between the scorpion and the parasite, as well as the frog and the protagonist, but the fact is that they are all interchangeable. The parasite dooms itself by gradually destroying its host, seemingly the one thing left alive to carry it over the metaphorical river. But the protagonist also dooms themselves by willfully allowing unknown machinery and flesh to invade their body, by abiding by their pre-programmed nature, for the purpose of fulfilling the scientific goals of their creators. These creators idolized erotic imagery, made apparent by the murals and statues in the game's final area, the Grand Citadel of Polis. In practice, however, the creators viewed reproduction as a more cold and mechanical function, a means to an end. They wished to engineer the ultimate versions of themselves, beings who could transcend both mind and flesh, using and abusing those they deemed as lesser pawns. It was this pursuit that resulted in the creation of the fleshy Beksiński-esque growths, which were used to power their evolving civilization, their machines, their guns, their people. Naturally, it came at a cost, namely the demise of their entire species. Out of the growths came hostile monstrosities, the enemies you fight in the game, which the people fought with tools made out of the same materials. In the end, like the scorpion, the creators were doomed by their own reasoning. They set out to advance their race, to achieve some ultimate level of perfection or enlightenment, but they never could advance themselves, because their way of achieving this goal was through destroying what they were. So if you really break down the story of Scorn, given that director Lubomir Peklar has openly stated that the game is actually an exploration of our world, is about the duality of our destruction, about those who cause it, those who allow it, and how easily one can become the other. Much of this reading is, of course, informed by the interviews and lore provided by the game's official art book, but I'd argue that the gist of it can still be understood just from playing the game. There are very deliberate themes injected into the world and story of Scorn. However, even if you don't understand one bit of what's going on, Peklar points out what I'd argue is one of the main draws of the game.
It would be nice if players discover the themes we've added, but if they see something else, that's equally valid. People's education and view on life will be imbued in the visuals in some way. It's not always about what is happening in the game, but how it makes you feel.
Even with all its vagueness, Scorn is undeniably a story about something. But it's also a mood piece, and the mood it wants to convey is a fusion of awe and utter disgust. One of my favorite moments in the whole game was when I got momentarily transfixed by some minor detail in the environment. I wasn't too sure what I was looking at, but I figured it was just there for aesthetic purposes. Then suddenly, that minor detail spit acid right in the protagonist's face, which made me physically jump in my chair. The so-called Mole Man from the very first puzzle dome is another standout. 2 hands are required to open the door to the next area, and whether you use the machine that frees the Mole Man or the one that turns him into a pile of flesh, you only really need his hand to proceed. You don't need to see or understand the bigger picture to have a strong reaction to this puzzle. You're actively exploiting this poor creature for your own selfish cause, and at this point, you barely even know what that cause is. You just do it because your curiosity to see what's beyond that damn door compels you to. You might not know what it all means, the hostile environment or the Mole Man, but you certainly know how it makes you feel. The developers might not fully agree with my reading of the game, or my reading of their words about the game, but at least we can all agree that Scorn strongly encourages you to explore not just its physical spaces, but what they mean to you. This is why those clips of people bashing Scorn at the start of this video concern me so much. I don't think people are allegedly acting all elitist because others can't interpret art, but because some refuse to. People who genuinely pride themselves on being openly anti-intellectual, who dismiss anyone who even tries to read a piece of art beyond the uttermost layers. I get the frustration around the notion that good or quote-unquote high art is supposed to be some kind of abstract puzzle to be solved. Art can, as a matter of fact, be as blatant as a frying pan to the crotch and be profound with its messaging all at the same time. Though sometimes, deciphering is an instrumental part of experiencing a particular piece of art. And for any self-proclaimed art or video game critic to claim that this is just an excuse for people to smell their own farts is simply lazy criticism. Worse, it's intellectually dishonest, because it deceives people into believing that there is less to find and appreciate in a piece of art than there actually is. That what truly makes you smart is being willfully ignorant. After all, why would you need to understand or explain a piece of art which you've successfully convinced your audience to be beneath you? You don't have to care about what anything in Scorn means, and you don't have to think about what it makes you feel, apart from disappointment or rage. No, Scorn isn't about nothing. It does have a story, and it can be interpreted even without the added context of the official art book. There are legitimate reasons to not appreciate Scorn, of course there are, but you're not going to find those reasons if you completely disregard its artistic intentions. Kierkegaard, yes, I'm going there, said that life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. I'd argue that dismissing art for reasons like these,
the only reason it's being hyped is because people are being like, you guys just don't understand it. It's amazing.
is to deny yourself the reality of the intended experience. And for what? Making yourself feel superior by dunking on people online? What a waste. It's completely valid to play video games for the sole purpose of escapist fun. There are plenty of games that are designed to basically be toys first and art second. You can choose to look at all video games that way, with a strictly binary fun or boring mentality. But at least admit that it's not automatically the game that deserves the blame when you are the one who knowingly chooses to disregard it. Sometimes you can just say that a game isn't for you, or that you didn't get it. That's what's so neat about games like Scorn. They're open to a variety of interpretations, but they also invite you to put in the work to broaden your knowledge, to discuss them with others or read up on things that will deepen or even confirm your own interpretation. One of the major criticisms against Scorn has been its combat system. It has been called slow, dreadful, even atrocious. What I believe these comments fail to recognize is that while the camera perspective is different, the rhythm of combat is identical to what you would find in any classic or classically inspired survival horror game. You ready your weapon and either slow to a crawl or stand perfectly still as you fire away at your pursuers. As they start closing in, you back away and repeat the process. The difference in Scorn, what I think is the actual reason why some have a problem with its combat, is that enemies are able to spit long-range acidic projectiles, which there are no real counters for, whereas your standard survival horror enemies generally only attack at close range. This results in the player having to be more cautious about their positioning, often requiring them to use the environment for cover, or to lure enemies closer one at a time. There's also, of course, the option of running past enemies, avoiding combat altogether and saving ammunition. Your starter weapon is this close-range grappling kind of instrument, with an animation that undoubtedly nods to the Xenomorph, Giger's most famous creation. This weapon never runs out of ammunition, though it has a limited amount of uses before it needs to recharge, which may put you in a tough spot since you'll be placed so close to your target. To survive, you have to juggle between your stronger weapons that do spend precious bullets and the one that doesn't, just like in your standard survival horror game. Once I realized that this was indeed that all-too-familiar combat rhythm, I experienced no issues with it. Not even with those gosh darn long-range attacks. I certainly had to use up a whole bunch of healing items throughout my initial playthrough, but that's just as integral to horror game combat as the violence itself. You hurt some, you lose some. However, someone who expects Scorn's combat to be more in line with traditional first-person shooters will lose a whole lot more. Projectile attacks are often a minor inconvenience in an FPS, because the player character will either have the movement speed and/or defensive maneuvers to compensate. If you play Scorn like an FPS, you will hate it. Simple as that. Because these projectiles will hit you a lot, especially if you are so brave as to try and shoot and reload out in the open, which is a slow process. My question is this: does this make Scorn's combat system bad? Or is this yet another case of people basing their negative criticism on expectations? Well, that depends. Combat is yet another means to an end, and that end is to make you feel weak, brittle, in a world that will swallow you whole if you're not careful enough. It fits perfectly with the world that Scorn takes place in. Does the combat system feel good to use? Not exactly, but what would that do to the desired effect of the combat? Having controls as smooth as the 2016 iteration of Doom would be as useless to Scorn as a jump button. The game was not built for it, and including it would have made the experience worse, since the dissonance would become immediately noticeable. I would personally aim my criticism towards the lack of visual and mechanical variety in the enemy design. Some foes are tougher than others, but in the end, you will deal with them in mostly the same way. That's a minor criticism though, because just like with the puzzles, combat isn't the main focus of Scorn. It's there to remind you of your place in this world. And it's also there to remind you that this is a world of violence. Violence, as well as ambition, is what ended this world. And even though it has ended, you're still participating in and actively causing more violence. And one has to wonder, what does this world have left that makes your own survival so important to you? The protagonist clearly wants to fulfill the ambitions of their creator, to transcend to another plane of existence. For a moment, it actually seems like they're going to succeed, even with their guts literally hanging out after having surgically removed the parasite. But then, with the rift to a different, hopefully better world mere meters away, the parasite returns. And as if the ending was written by Jean-Claude Passeron himself, the protagonist and the parasite, the scorpion and the frog, ultimately become one. A fleshy, transmogrified monument to the failures of a people who tried to find enlightenment through their own destruction. The final image is clearly meant to parallel the final line and title of the Harlan Ellison short story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. It's a very appropriate image to end on, since both stories tackle the theme of people being punished for the world-shaking actions of people that came before them, people who had higher societal and governmental power. Compared to them, the protagonists of Scorn never really had mouths to begin with, literally, because their voices or screams wouldn't have made any difference. It's not a satisfying ending, but satisfaction was never on the table. You don't enter a building destroyed by arson and expect to find cake. There's a famous idiom which says that hope dies last. And well, hope left this world long before the protagonist was even born. But you know what? this isn't actually the end. Remember the opening cutscene? Did you notice how the scene shifted between images of the tower and some fleshy caverns? Well, the reason for these quick transitions is that the cutscene doesn't just show us the beginning, but how it really ends. Artist previously known as the Parasite wakes up, back in their original form, removes themselves from the monument, and slowly crawls away. The purpose of having the prologue and epilogue play out identically, to the point that it's initially difficult to tell which is which, is that the ex-Parasite's new journey will be indistinguishable from the one the pre-Parasite started at the beginning. They will still be stuck in a dying world, with nothing but their pre-programmed Sisyphean instincts and behaviors to guide them to the same conclusion, time and time again, until there is truly nothing and no one left. It's a deeply pessimistic note to end on, but there's something genuinely inspiring about it too. After all this, when the world has nothing left to offer but a desolate wasteland of agony and loneliness, life still finds a way. Perhaps hope dies last because it simply refuses to die altogether. You absolutely can criticize Scorn for being a series of digital art installations, rather than any version of the game you initially imagined it to be. But if we are to recognize video games as art, we also have to recognize that video games can simply be a series of digital art installations. It's okay to not like the combat system, or the puzzles, or the occasionally troublesome checkpoint system. But as a whole, and as a series of digital art installations specifically, I would argue that Scorn is a masterpiece. It takes the work of Giger and Beksiński and makes them not just interactive, but faithfully turns their themes of biomechanicalism, sexuality, and societal decay into a cohesive and thought-provoking narrative. A narrative that feels particularly relevant in a world where some of our evolving technologies are actively making life worse, under the guise that they're actually being used to do the complete opposite. Scorn immerses you in a world where you will do terrible things, both to others and to the player character, just because it's so tantalizing to see what comes next. It's the perfect example of effective body horror. It's gross, yet you can't fight the primal urge to see more of it. Sure, Giger or Beksiński could perhaps have collaborated on a video game related project like this, which contrary to Ebb Software's efforts would have been able to avoid the label of derivative. But neither Giger nor Beksiński are with us anymore, so Ebb Software was the best we got, and they clearly took the challenge seriously. There are some clearly visible corners that were cut. The world isn't as open and interconnected as either Metroid Prime or Dark Souls, and your choices don't affect the overall narrative whatsoever. Though I personally don't expect literal perfection out of a masterpiece. It's unobtainable. What I do expect is an overall successful execution of a strong vision and a lasting impact. And for me, Scorn delivers in both regards. Most importantly though, I think Scorn makes a hard-hitting argument against the idea of style over substance. For in the case of Scorn, style is substance. I don't expect anyone to watch this video and suddenly go, you know what? I was all wrong. Scorn isn't shit, it's the shit. But I hope that this video will help Scorn be remembered for what it actually was. What it attempted and, in my personal opinion, successfully did. Then again, maybe I'm just smelling my own farts. And if you too enjoy the smell of my farts, you can support me making more through Patreon. We recently started a new Patreon-exclusive podcast called The Romero Chronicles, where my longtime friend Freya Carolina Lundström and I go through all of George A. Romero's feature-length directorial work. So if you become a patron right now, that's just one of the several perks you'll get. And speaking of patrons, here are some of my current ones, who I wish to thank. Anna Day, Callum Wally, Christopher Berger, D.E. Wright, Duncan Scott, Eben Phantom, Frans Johannes Foylner, Håvard Krugerud, Jack Lightfoot, Jesse Earl, Kalis, L. Tantivy, Lesser Sage of Stars, Losty, Mackenzie, Nicole, Quillightful, Robin Hartz, Sablecal, Sethsard, Silkmoth, TB Skyen, 10 Tiny Kittens, and Vinders. I also want to thank Hot Cider for the thumbnail, Eurothug4000, Mira Cox, and Pixel a Day for proofreading the script, and Eurothug4000, Pixel a Day, and Casey Explosion for providing your voices to this video. And that's it for now. The next video is going to be on Indica, and... well, actually, that's not going to be the first video that comes out after I've turned 30, because that's this video. So if you didn't know, I turned 30 recently, and I've already started experiencing the bodily pains. This decade is gonna be great.